picking back up on Chapter 4, the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System. In Chapter 3, we covered President Taft's undoing. He refused to support the network's plan to create a central bank in the United States, and since the network couldn't fully dominate the political system of the United States without control of its credit and money supply, Taft was toppled and Wilson was installed. Shortly after taking office, Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law, and the central bank was born. However, this isn't the full story of how the Federal Reserve System came to be. Just as citizens were misled into believing that they chose Wilson in the 1912 election, they were also misled into believing the Federal Reserve Act was written to protect them from predatory international bankers. The sad truth is, predatory international bankers secretly wrote the legislation themselves and used government to turn their wishes into law. This is a piece of the puzzle that Quigley seems to have missed. He acknowledges that the network titans like Rockefeller and Morgan had enough power to cause a financial panic whenever they chose. He admits that they used their power to their own advantage, wrecking individual corporations at the expense of the holders of common stocks. He even admits that J.P. Morgan precipitated the Panic of 1907. But the fact that their power could have been used to both take out competition and incite public demands for monetary reform that would be directed by the network itself, is not covered. It's a glaring omission. In short, the network needed a central bank to dominate the political system of the United States, but it needed another crisis to financially sell the scheme. With that perspective in mind, the Panic of 1907 looks very different. First, J.P. Morgan causes the panic, which to this day is rarely mentioned. He and Rockefeller halt the panic, for which, to this day, they are still portrayed as saviors. And out of the suffering and chaos, public demands for legislative intervention finally reached critical mass. The government then forms a monetary commission to investigate and solve the problem, headed by none other than the network insider and U.S. Senator Nelson Aldrich. And the commission decides that the central bank is needed to solve the nation's woes. From there, it was simply a matter of writing the legislation and handing it off to the right politicians. I missed a footnote. Okay. After the United States, but it needed another crisis, here's a footnote. The Panic of 1873 and 1893 caused widespread suffering and stirred demands for monetary reform. Public opinion was already leaning heavily toward the need for legislative intervention, and the Panic of 1907 provided the final push. If the idea that bankers would actually create a panic to serve their interests seems like a stretch, consider the case of Nicholas Biddle. As President Andrew Jackson was trying to shut down Biddle's second bank of the United States, the banker intentionally crashed the economy and blamed the ensuing financial crisis on Jackson. This served to turn public opinion against Jackson and in favor of the bank. Discussing the tactic, Biddle commented, "Nothing but widespread suffering will produce any effect on Congress. Our only safety is in pursuing a steady course of firm restriction. I have no doubt that such a course will ultimately lead to recharter of the bank." Referring to Jackson, Biddle remarked, "This worthy president thinks that because he has scalped Indians and imprisoned judges, he is to have his way with the bank. He is mistaken. as quoted in The Creature from Jekyll Island, page 354. Moving on to where we left off. Of course, the network had to conceal the fact that it would be writing the legislation itself, and this presented some problems. The lengths it went to in order to hide its role reads like a scene out of a James Bond novel. If you were alive in 1910, you wouldn't have been invited to the meeting. In fact, you would have never known that a meeting took place. Despite the enormous impact on your country's future, the scheme to create a new monetary system was none of your business. This is where the story of the Federal Reserve System begins. The banking empires of Rockefeller, Rothschild, Morgan, and Warburg sent 6 representatives on their behalf to the privately owned Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. To prevent the men from being recognized, the island's permanent employees were sent on vacation and carefully screened temps took their place. Each man was sworn to secrecy and instructed to only use their first name to further conceal their identity. Nearly 2 decades passed before any of the conspirators publicly admitted they participated in the meeting. In that meeting, the financial elite created for themselves the monetary system that we live under today. Had this meeting been covered in the press, the headline might have read, "Powerful bankers conspire on private island to seize monetary control." But then again, it had been covered in the press. The Federal Reserve Act would have never passed. Citizens wanted Congress to weaken the destructive powers of international banking interests, not expand them. Unfortunately, the Jekyll Island story didn't leak until 1916. Years after the damage had already been done, and even after it was exposed, educators, commenters, and historians continued to deny the meeting ever took place. Anyone who pointed out the nefarious origins and authors of the Federal Reserve Act were smeared and dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. Fortunately, the truth finally did come out, and the conspiracy theorists were vindicated, as usual. Perhaps the most definitive admission came from Frank A. Vanderlip, president of the most powerful New York bank at the time, National City Bank of New York, now Citibank. There was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen, or else all our time and effort would be wasted. If it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress. Although the Aldrich Federal Reserve Plan was defeated when it bore the name Aldrich, nevertheless, its essential points were all contained in the plan that finally was adopted, Frank A. Vanderlip, in 1935. Saturday Evening Post article, From Farm Boy to Financier. Despite the admission over 75 years ago, despite other participants and their biographers who've admitted the same, despite the fact that the Federal Reserve's chairman, Ben Bernanke, returned to Jekyll Island in 2010 to commemorate the Fed's founding 100 years earlier. Footnote, from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta website titled A Return to Jekyll Island, the conference was held to mark the centenary of the 1910 Jekyll Island meeting that resulted in draft legislation, the Aldrich Plan, for the creation of the U.S. Central Bank. Now, where was I? Okay, Still, the vast majority of people have never heard of the trip to Jekyll Island and have no idea that international bankers created the system that was supposed to protect them from international bankers. But again, should we be surprised? The education system and mainstream media are the two most powerful instruments for distributing information and creating mass awareness. Regarding the media, just a handful of global news corporations can, in one day, make billions of people around the world simultaneously aware of something that was completely unknown the day before. With this kind of power, the network can choose to spread any lie or withhold any truth that it chooses. Then there is education. Millions of students can be taught the real story behind the Federal Reserve System, or they can be taught the smokescreen of government intervention to protect the public. They can be taught the dangers of centralized banking power, or they can be taught nothing at all. At the end of the day, if people aren't looking beyond the network's instruments for their information, they cannot expect to know what the network doesn't want them to know. Even Quigley, apparently, is unaware of the trip to Jekyll Island. He makes no mention of the meeting in either Tragedy and Hope or the Anglo-American establishment. Since he obviously had no aversion to exposing comparable duplicity, it's reasonable to assume he didn't know that particular part of the Fed's history. Or perhaps he consulted some of the respected educators and historians who convinced him there was no evidence that it ever happened. Whatever the reason, it's an unfortunate oversight. Nothing demonstrates the network's power more convincingly than its ability to secretly write legislation that governs or outright creates its own instruments. And on that note, with its legislation successfully written, Taft ousted, and Wilson in the White House, it would seem that the network could rest easy. However, there was one more swindle needed to guarantee passage of the Federal Reserve Act. To help garner public support, the very same people who helped author the legislation on Jekyll Island began speaking out publicly against it. As the Federal Reserve Act moved closer to its birth, both Aldrich and Vanderlip threw themselves into a great public display of opposition. No opportunity was overlooked to make a statement to the press, or anyone else of public prominence, expressing their eternal animosity to this monstrous legislation, since Aldrich was recognized as associated with the Morgan interests and Vanderlip was president of Rockefeller's National City Bank. The public was skillfully led to believe that the big bankers were mortally afraid of the proposed Federal Reserve Act. The Nation was the only prominent publication to point out that every one of the horrors described by Aldrich and Vanderlip could have been equally ascribed to the Aldrich plan as well. But this lone voice was easily drowned by the great cacophony of deception and propaganda. The newly packaged Glass-Owen Federal Reserve Act, which mirrored Aldrich's vision in all essential provisions, was put forward by Democrats as being radically different. A bill written by selfless public servants to protect the citizenry from selfish, out-of-control banking interests. And as Vanderlip, Aldrich, and other big business Republicans continued to attack the new legislation, more and more well-meaning Americans fell for the ruse. The voice of the people expresses the mind of the people, and that mind is made up for it by those persons who understand the manipulation of public opinion. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind and contrive new ways to guide the world. The voice of the people expresses the... Wait a minute. Sorry about that. Meanwhile, as the citizens were being guided to the desired opinion publicly, Edward Mandell Howes ensured that Wilson and Congress were being properly guided privately. The intimate papers of Colonel Howes leave little doubt that he acted as the direct liaison between the network and relevant politicians during the creation of the central bank. Howes directed the politicians while Paul Warburg, the primary author of Jekyll Island legislation, directed Howes. Ed Griffin summarizes Howes' role this way. As far as the banking issue was concerned, Colonel Howes was the President of the United States, and all interested parties knew it. Wilson made no pretense at knowledge of banking theory, he said. The greatest embarrassment of my political career has been that active duties seem to deprive me of time for careful investigation. I seem almost obligated to form conclusions from impressions instead of from study. I wish that I had more knowledge, more thorough acquaintance with the matters involved. To which Charles Seymour adds, Colonel Howes was indefatigable in providing the President the knowledge that he sought. The Colonel was the unseen guardian angel of the bill. Mr. Mandell Howes. Here is a perfect example of Quigley's observation. Ignorance of banking led politicians to trust the advice of bankers, and that this was consistently good for bankers, but was oftenly disastrous for governments and the people generally. The great irony is that Quigley himself does not seem to fully understand the nature of the banking system. There are few things in Tragedy and Hope that support this conclusion. I'll cover them briefly. First, on page 58, Quigley presents what he calls a paradox of banking practice. Bankers prefer monetary deflation, a reduction in the money supply, because it increases both the value of the money that they control and the interest rates that they can charge borrowers. However, he states that they inevitably abandon the deflationary idea in favor of inflating the money supply, which they accomplish by issuing bank loans, because of their eagerness to lend money at interest. To Quigley's credit, he acknowledges the bankers can gain an extra form of profit from this supposed conflict by increasing the money supply with loans. They increase the indebtedness of others and drive prices up. Then, by decreasing the money supply, they can force many debtors into foreclosure and confiscate whatever collateral was pledged to secure their loans. He also acknowledges that the manipulation of the money supply was a prominent aspect of the so-called business cycle, and that it was destructive to business and industry. Got dry fingers. My question is, where is the paradox? If you're a member of the network, this is a fundamental feature of the banking system that you've created. What better way to crush or control competitors in business and industry? You not only enjoy the normal benefits of controlling loans, loaning money to only those who yield control, withholding it from those who resist, but you also have a mechanism for trapping debtors and then seizing their assets. If you do decide to confiscate their collateral, rather than bury the borrower in additional debt with additional strings attached, you've effectively gained ownership of a real asset with money that you created out of thin air. Remember, that's how our current banking system operates. When the network wants to issue a loan, it pulls a check from its magic checkbook, writes in the loan amount, and poof, the money for the loan is created on the spot. Quigley states that too much deflation could sometimes be disastrous for the bankers because it forced the value of the collateral below the amount of the loans it secured. Sorry, But even this claim needs addressed. An unpaid principal loan balance of, say, $100,000, secured by an asset that sells for only $80,000 or less, does not necessarily equal a loss for the bank. And if the goal is to drive a competitor into bankruptcy, then the math involving so-called losses gets even more interesting. What appears to be a loss on paper due to a gap between the amount of principal owed on a loan and what is ultimately obtained during liquidation can actually be viewed as a great investment. I missed a footnote somewhere. Oh, after $80,000 or less does not necessarily equal to a loss for the bank. Footnote. As a simple exercise, consider an interest loan of only $100,000 at 6% interest. At the end of 5 years, the debtor defaults and the asset is sold for only $80,000. In this case, it looks like the bank has lost money. The debtor still owed $100,000 and the bank only recovered $80,000 from the sale of the asset. However, if you factor in the interest payments that were made over 5 years, $30,000, you see that the bank actually walks away with a profit of $10,000. $80,000 sale price plus $30,000 in interest payments equals $110,000. In rare instances, the bankers might actually lose some of the dollars that they created out of thin air for a loan. What then happens? Those losses tend to be turned into profits via government bailouts. Moving on. Sure, a portion of the dollars created out of thin air are not fully repaid, but that cost is minor compared to what it would have cost to purchase the competitor outright. And in dividends of market consolidation, and the return on investment is simply fantastic. Next, there is the issue of the gold standard. Here again, it seems that Quigley has fallen for a false narrative. In this case, that the gold standard was the most sophisticated mechanism of monetary control that the elite could devise. That gold, rather than the control of money and debt which gold only facilitated, was the root of their monetary power. If these myths are accepted as true, then his assertion that bankers sincerely tried to save the gold standard makes perfect sense. However, a closer look at their actions and the ways which they benefited from those actions leads to a more logical conclusion. It was far more profitable to destroy the gold standard than it was to preserve it. To create ever-increasing piles of money and debt out of thin air, the limitations of gold had to be removed. On page 256 and 257 of Tragedy and Hope, Quigley nearly stumbles into the truth. While discussing the beginning of World War I, he tells the story of military men and financial experts who believed the war would be over within 6 months. This prediction was based on the fact that gold reserves used to pay for the expenses of war would be depleted within that amount of time. However, by suspending the gold standard, the duration of the war, along with the enormous debts and banker profits associated with it, grew far beyond anything that a gold standard would have supported. All the great powers were on the gold standard, under which paper money could be converted into gold on demand. However, each country suspended the gold standard at the outbreak of war. This removed the automatic limitation on the supply of paper money. Each country proceeded to pay for the war by borrowing from the banks. The banks created the money, which they lent by merely giving the government a deposit of any size against which the government could draw checks. The banks were no longer limited in the amount of credit they could create because they no longer had to pay out gold for checks on demand. The problem of public debt became steadily worse because governments were financing such a large part of their activities by bank credit. From this perspective, The advantages of permanently suspending the gold standard are self-evident. When a bank creates paper money, loans that are backed by gold, it runs the risk of losing its gold reserves. When a bank creates paper money loans that are backed by nothing, then its gold reserves are perfectly safe. Additionally, without gold backing, there are no longer any firm limits on how many loans the banking system can create. Limits, if any, are determined by the wishes of those who control the system and the limitless borrowing needs of government, business, and individuals. Last but not least, Quigley asserts multiple times that the reins of power passed from financial capitalism to monopoly capitalism, with the destruction of the gold standard. Once again, implying a loss of gold backing equaled a loss for those who wielded banking power. It would be easy enough to dismiss this supposed shift in power as a distinction without a difference because, at most, it amounted to a shift in methods of control rather than a shift in management. The same network that controlled financial capitalism paved the way for monopoly capitalism, and the primary leader of the network, Lord Milner himself, had written of his desire to abandon the gold standard as early as 1923. But there is a larger point to be made here. If monopoly capitalism is all-powerful because it can self-finance, manipulate the price of goods within its market, and use its inflated monopolistic profits to wield monetary influence, then there are no words to sufficiently describe the power of financial capitalism. Bullet point number 1. Not only can financial capitalists self-finance, they can do so by simply creating money out of thin air and loaning it to others at interest. What could possibly be more powerful than that? Bullet point number 2. Not only can financial capitalists manipulate the price of goods in a particular market, they can manipulate the price of goods in any market. Real estate, food, energy, stocks, bonds, education, anything that has a price will be affected by those who manipulate the quantity and flow of money. Bullet point number 3. Not only do financial capitalists enjoy the influence of monopolistic profits, they enjoy the influence of having monopolized their creation of money itself. Stated another way, when a monopoly capitalist accumulates his first $1 billion, it's only because others have borrowed that $1 billion into existence from the network's banking system. If Quigley truly understood the network's banking system, he would have never fallen for the lie, undoubtedly perpetuated by the network itself. That banking power peaked in the 1930s. The exact opposite is true. It wasn't until the 1930s that international bankers began chipping away at the limitations of gold and inching the world ever closer to a purely debt-based standard. As powerful as the network's position was under the gold standard, it had increased immeasurably under their 100% debt-based standard. They can now create, destroy, and direct money, and direct as much money as they see fit. They currently earn interest on every single dollar in existence, because every single dollar in existence has been created and loaned into the economy by them. Accordingly, their debt-based system guarantees that nations will remain forever trapped in debt. As a nation and its citizens attempt to reduce their debt to bankers, they simultaneously reduce their nation's money supply. Paying off all debt would reduce the money supply to zero. Not only would this be impossible, but financial chaos and emergency government borrowing would be triggered long before any significant reduction in debt was achieved. This is not a system that was designed with our best interests in mind. In the next chapter, we'll cover the network's banking system in more detail. We'll also cover the steps that we must take to free ourselves from illegitimate money control. That's it for that chapter.